Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's How I Would Write Game of Thrones Season 7 Part 2. So this is Part 2 of a 3-part series that I'm doing of how I would write Season 7 of Game of Thrones, because as many of you know, I was not happy with Season 7 of Game of Thrones, so this is my version of what I would do if I was in charge of Game of Thrones. So basically my fan fiction, yes it is, my fan fiction out there. Now this is Part 2, so I'm assuming that you have seen Part 1, so I'll have a link in the description below. In case you haven't seen it, you should go watch that first, because I build off of stuff I've established in Part 1. I will also put the link into Part 3 in the description below once I have Part 3 up in a couple of days. Anyway, I'm not going to bother with more preamble, I'm just going to jump right into it. Daenerys. So after the battle, rather than Jaime just magically teleporting to the other side of the river when he was sinking to the bottom of it, the Dothraki fished Jaime out of the water, saving him from drowning with all this heavy armor which was pushing him to the bottom, and then they take him prisoner. And Daenerys classifies him as a very high-class prisoner, so she immediately has him transported to the dungeons of Dragonstone as soon as she can. We then get the same scene where she gets the rest of the survivors, not Jaime though, because he's too important, but the rest of them, including Randyll, Dickon, Tarly, put them all in and demands that they bend the knee or die, and Randyll and Dickon refuse, so she burns them alive. That's all the same, that was all good. So then, on Dragonstone, we see Tyrion visit Jaime in the dungeons, where they have it out. He accuses Tyrion of betraying his family, but Tyrion says that his family betrayed him first. And so they have this sort of rough interactions. We also get some character interactions with Jon Snow visiting Jaime in the dungeons, where they reminisce about having met in Winterfell shortly before Jon joined the Night's Watch. And Jaime says that this isn't the first time Stark visited him and tried to intimidate him when he was being held prisoner. And that turned out pretty well for him last time, so he's not concerned. So he has that same arrogant demeanor that he had when he was in prison last time, and that he always has, quite frankly. So we later see that Daenerys has charged Highgarden with her dragons, the Dothraki, and her newly acquired former Lannister and Tarly army. The army that bent the knee, and they joined her ranks, so they're now dressed in armor bearing the Targaryen sigil. How they got this armor, maybe they had a blacksmith on hand or whatever, maybe she had the barrels of them ready to hand out, I don't know, but the show does stuff like this all the time, so I'm going to do it too. Anyway, they identify the leaders of the occupation of Highgarden, like the soldiers who betrayed them. They're like, oh, those are the Lannister soldiers in charge of this occupation of Highgarden. So she goes straight to them with her dragon and burns them alive. And then she demands that the rest of this depleted army surrender the castle immediately or face the same fate. So they do, and so she acquires yet more soldiers to her army. She makes a big speech to the people of Highgarden that they will be cared for, taken care of, well protected, gives them enough food, but says that the rest of the food she acquired during the battle will go to feeding the rest of the people of Westeros, setting herself up. Rather than in the actual episode itself, she just said, oh, I'm here to protect and look out for the common folks, but she doesn't put her money where her mouth is. She doesn't back this up. So, in my version, I want to make it very clear that she actually is helping them out. And of course, this is a part of a larger strategy where we get more follow-up to the aftermath of the Lutrine battle, setting up the political stage of Westeros, and instead of jumping straight into the main storyline like the actual episode 5 did. We're going to take the time to establish things all together. Anyway, Cersei. So after the battle, we see Cersei conferring with Qyburn and Euron. She's furious that her southern allies are gone and that Jaime's being held prisoner. And many of their soldiers have now joined Daenerys' ranks, and she demands that they find a way to rescue Jaime. Euron apologetically says that there's nothing he can do because Dragonstone is too heavily fortified, but Cersei suspects that it's because he doesn't want Jaime to be rescued, and seeing their interactions before, I think there's some merit there. So Qyburn mentions that apparently she was wrong about Daenerys' dragons not being a threat and not being real, which pisses Cersei off, and she asks him if he's blaming her, but he says not at all, but now he needs to make plans to deal with this threat accordingly. So now he's starting to make plans to deal with the dragons. She then asks Euron to hurt Daenerys. He says he'll do what he can, but the fighting is mostly inland now, where he can't be much of help. So Qyburn asks if they should pull the Lannister soldiers out of the Riverlands and fall back to King's Landing, as more than half of their forces were either killed or turned to Daenerys' side after the Loot Train battle, but Cersei refuses, saying that she wouldn't give up an inch. Now, this is very important, very vital to me, that we have that line where it says more than half of their entire forces, the Lannister forces altogether as a whole, more than half were lost during the Loot Train battle, because it was never made clear in the show itself how much the Loot Train battle actually devastated them. They had vague talk about, oh, it was a lot, we lost a lot of men, this hurt us a lot, but they didn't say exactly how much. Now, saying more than half is still kind of vague, but it gives the viewer a much clearer picture of how much it did hurt them. Like, you don't have to be very specific. You don't have to say 10,500 men were lost, or roughly 67% of our forces were lost. You just say more than half, which is still vague, but it's clear enough to make it much clearer just how devastating this defeat was for them. Arya, Sansa, and Bran. So Sansa placates the Northern Lords, where Lord Glover is, bitching about Jon being away. That scene is exactly the same. That worked. And Arya confronting Sansa afterwards, that she talked to the Lord. She talked to her about having her talking to the Lords showed her lust for power, and Arya's not really trusting Sansa and thinks she always wanted this job and suspects that she's plotting something against Jon. All that is the same, except Arya brings up Littlefinger more, and in fact there's an added element to the scene, because in my version Arya is actually correct, because Sansa is plotting something with Littlefinger because they have that contingency plan, and so Arya is correcting. She can sense that something's wrong. So Sansa tells Arya about Littlefinger's idea that she marry Robin Arryn. And that Sansa thinks it's a good idea too, and she tries to convince Arya to do it, but Arya outright refuses, saying, "No way, I'm not marrying, that's not who I am, and plus, Littlefinger is just trying to get rid of me." So Arya investigates Littlefinger more by using her faces. This is another thing in my notes. It's all capital letters with 5 exclamation points. Why didn't she use her faces in the show? And in the show, she never actually uses her faces while she's at Winterfell. Yes, she just tells people about it. Why would she do that? That's an advantage she has nobody knows about. She's not going to go around blurring it out. In fact, she's going to use them. So she sneaks around using her faces, and she sees that Littlefinger is talking to Walken about hidden documents Sansa wants to hide. So it's similar to what happened in the show, except Arya's using her faces. She breaks into the room using the faces and steals the letter, finds the letter that she wrote, that Sansa wrote in King's Landing as a child in season 1, whatever. That stays the same, except Arya uses her faces. But then Littlefinger's creeping in the shadows, that reveals the same. However, the implications aren't just that Littlefinger set Arya up and he knew that this would happen. The implications also that Littlefinger is aware of Arya's faceless abilities, which why wouldn't he be? Because he's Littlefinger. He knows everything. He's a mastermind, scheming bastard. So of course he knows about Arya's faceless abilities, and he used it against her. The Hound and the Brotherhood without banners. So the Hound and the Brotherhood arrive in Winterfell because, of course, they stop by Winterfell on their way north. It makes absolutely no sense for them not to. Tyrion mentioned in season 1 that there were not very many places to stop for food and shelter on the way to the wall, between the wall, in the north on the way to the wall. So of course they'd stop by Winterfell. So the Hound encounters Arya there. They have a friendly exchange. They don't say much to each other, but there's an underlining mutual respect there. And it ends with the Hound saying that he's glad that she's okay, and she says the same to him, because that's an important callback to her time in Bravos when Jake and Hagar and other people there made her realize that she actually cared for the Hound, where she was trying to convince herself that she hated him, but Jaqen's like, you lied to yourself. And so she came to that realization. I think she even said later that she realizes that she actually cared for the Hound. So here we see that encapsulated, although she's kind of non-feeling emotionless, but the whole thing about her returning to Winterfell is about her reconnecting with her emotions. So she's still kind of soft and distant, but she just kind of like the way she was with Hot Pie, but just acknowledges more that she's okay. She's glad that the Hound's okay. Alright, so that's all I have for episode 5. So you might be thinking, well, that's a very short episode 5. You don't actually have much much going on there. But I think we can have a lot more, like, I don't want to say pad the episode out, but basically pad the episode out with a lot of, like, character interactions, conversations between, like, Jon and Dany. You get Arya and the Hound, Sansa and Bran, like, mix it up. And showed Daenerys with the Dothraki a bit, making plans at Highgarden, stuff like that. Just get a lot of these character interactions. And you might be saying, well, you're just adding in filler. But no, I actually, and this is ironic because sometimes I do call character interactions filler, but it's very important to have this, to establish these characters, to establish the political landscape, to establish the storyline and what's going on, and how the character's dealing with this. Because this is something all 6 seasons, particularly the first 3, although I would argue season 3 does it a bit too much, but I won't get into that. But all 6 seasons have done. They take the time after important events like the Loot Train battle to take a breath, see how this affects the people, how it affects the landscape, get the character interactions. That's very important. That is exactly what we needed in season 7. Not jumping straight into another storyline about the White Walkers. That's crazy. You need the time. Take a breath, establish a character. It gives the story a lot more weight. It gives the characters more weight. It makes the viewer more involved, more invested in what's going on. It doesn't seem like events are just happening and people are just going from place to place like it did in the actual season 7, where there's no emotional investment. Take the time to do these character interactions so you have the emotional investment. Daenerys. So, Jorah Mormont arrives at Highgarden after having been cured from grayscale and has a loving reunion with Daenerys. So, as I mentioned in my version of episode 5, Daenerys went to Highgarden and retook it and gave a great inspirational speech. So, in episode 6, she's still at Highgarden, and Jorah, of course, going from Old Town to Highgarden is not that much of a journey, so it's not too far-fetched that he gets there in the next episode, and he probably heard that Daenerys was there, but we're not going to see that on screen. We're just going to assume that as he shows up and says, goes straight to her, and they have a really nice reunion. So instead of this reunion focusing on his jealousy of Jon, as it did in the show, and then him just fucking off north immediately after he returns to her, Jorah does what he did best in the first 3 seasons of Game of Thrones. He offers Daenerys sage wisdom. So, first of all, like, the way the show handled the Daenerys and Jorah reunion was just appalling. These are 2 characters that it's a relationship, even though it's never got romantic, much to Jorah's chagrin. It's still a relationship that we followed for a long time, that we're invested in, and they just blew through it. Like, Jorah just shows up and says, oh, it's good to see you, and that's basically it. And then Jorah offers to go up north, which is BS. Also, the other thing is, ever since he left, he got kicked out of Daenerys' company after she found that he was a spy for King Robert. Ever since then, they sort of changed the dynamic between Jorah and Daenerys, but it makes sense. Like, they needed to for the story. But because in the first 3.5 seasons, Jorah was, I used to refer to him as Lord Exposition because he would always spout out exposition and explain things to Daenerys. He was a good tool for the writers to get the audience to know about certain things in the air. But he had sage advice. He had great wisdom. I think that's what set him apart from his book counterpart, is that he had this sort of wise mentor type figure to Daenerys, which is, I'm sure, how she saw him, and so she valued him in that role as being able to give her sage advice and tell her what to do. So I understand that in season 5, season 6, they had a different dynamic, so they couldn't have that same dynamic anymore. But season 7, there's no reason why they shouldn't, because he's now cured of grayscale. She's now forgiven him. She's now happy to see him again. So we should get that same dynamic that we got in the first 3.5 seasons, where he's offering her sage advice. And this point in stage where she's trying to conquer Westeros is when she needs that advice the most, because she was relying on Tyrion and various other people, but Jorah would have a different perspective, one in which she would respect, because he was there with her from the very beginning. So in my version, we get scenes of her conferring with him and him giving some great advice and telling her about the current situation in Westeros and how best to win it. So Daenerys asks him if he agrees with Tyrion's strategy of not attacking King's Landing as not to be seen as an evil invader. And Jorah says that he agrees to a degree, but thinks that Tyrion is taking not attacking the Lannisters a bit too far, not out of any active thoughts of betrayal, but of subconscious ties to his family, because he can't help it, that's still his family, regardless of how much he may want Daenerys to be in power. So Jorah says that there are better ways to defeat Cersei, but still without coming off as an evil invader. So when Daenerys asks about Jon Snow, Jorah says that she should ally with him now and worry about who bends the knee to whom later. When she pushes back against this, saying how can she be the Queen of Westeros if not everyone's going to recognize her as the Queen or bend the knee to her, and Jorah says it's more important for potential allies to come together to defeat the common enemy first. Which does seem like the kind of sage advice, because I totally agree with this advice, it seems like the kind of sage advice that Jorah would give. So Daenerys then comes up with a plan and asks Jorah to come with her, so she takes him on a ride on Drogon and they fly all the way over to Casterly Rock. So this would be a cool adventure scene. It is a bonding moment for Jorah and Daenerys, again showing that relationship there. Instead of focusing, because the show focused too much on Jorah's romantic feelings for her by having him look jealous at Jon, that's basically all we saw. Where in the first 3 seasons, Jorah's romantic feelings were kind of just, they were underneath the surface. They were a subplot, they were kind of there, but they weren't the main focus. The main focus was the how much Jorah wants Daenerys to rule and how much he believes in her, and Daenerys, how she looks up to him as a mentor and as someone who's very trusted friend. So that's what should be at the surface. So that's what's at the surface in this version. So as they ride over to Casterly Rock, it's a good bonding moment, and Jorah's and all as he gets to ride a dragon for the first time. So, let's see. So when they go to Casterly Rock, she hangs back a bit with Drogon for Jorah's protection, has the other 2 dragons swoop in and destroys what remains of Euron's fleet that is protecting the harbor of Casterly Rock. Not all of Euron's fleet is there, because most of them have fucked off to do some other things after they destroyed the initial fleet, but a few ships stayed behind to sort of guard the fleet, but the other 2 dragons come in and make easy work with them, destroying them, and then Daenerys lands in Casterly Rock with Jorah, and so they meet with Grey Worm. And so Daenerys gives Jorah and Grey Worm a mission to go into the Riverlands, where the House of the Riverlands, the Houses of the Riverlands, led by the Tullys, are currently engaged with the very thin Lannister forces trying to hold the Riverlands for the Lannisters, and tells them to assist the Tullys and make an alliance with them, offering to feed the people of the Riverlands with the food they require during the battle. Grey Worm will lead the military, while Jorah will serve as her spokesperson in diplomatic matters. After leaving a small force to hold Castle Rock, they agreed to this mission. So to me, this is exactly what we needed to see in this show. We need to see, this is actually the first part of my version. I'll get more into this later, but we need to see Daenerys trying to ensure her rule over Westeros, to rather than being concerned of taking King's Landing, being concerned of winning over the Seven Kingdoms, just like Aegon did during his conquest. So she got the Reach, so now she's moving on to the Riverlands and the Western Lands effectively. So Daenerys returns to Dragonstone, where Jon Snow informs her that he received word from Winterfell about an important White Walker threat, and he needs to urgently return to the north to deal with that. So they have a few more scenes building their romance, but not kicking it in quite yet, as Daenerys realizes she doesn't want Jon to go and will miss him. So again, more showing, not telling, with how Jon and Daenerys are becoming romantic, having romantic feelings about each other. So she then takes Jorah's advice and offers an alliance with Jon, and they worry about who bends the knee to whom later, where she promises to turn her full attention to the White Walker invasion once Cersei is defeated, as long as he sends men to help in that goal. Now, in the show, when she said, "Oh, I'll help you take the north once Cersei's defeated," and Jon's like, "There's no time for that." But I dismissed that argument because they muck around up north capturing a white anyway, so clearly there is time for that. And I think that was just a plot device. I think Jon's smart enough to know, even though he would like to get straight to the White Walker invasion and wouldn't like to waste time with the Cersei bullshit, but I think he's smart enough to realize that that's what he needs to do in order to secure Daenerys' alliance, to secure the dragon, secure the help that he knows that he needs. If they make quick work of Cersei and get this over with, then they can get to the real meat. And I think he's smart enough to realize. And plus, they're both sort of compromising in this matter, because Daenerys is letting him have the main forces of his armies up to defend the White Walkers. She's just asking for a small force in return, and she's willing to give him her full support. So she's actually bending a lot in this version, and so Jon would also bend as well, saying, "Okay, I'll wait a little bit, let you take care of Cersei, but then we got to get to the main thing." So he says that, so Jon says he can't spare much, but he will send the Manderleys with the ships to provide siege aid to the siege of King's Landing. She nods that his public support of her rule will mean actually a lot more. So that's just the fact that he's declared the North and the Vale effectively, because they're allied now. The fact that he's declaring both of them for Daenerys, that will mean a lot more than any actual support. And so he's sending, I'm saying he's sending the Manderleys with warships, but I think in the novels, in Ice and Fire lore, the Manderleys actually don't have warships. But come on, the show is always played fast and loose with lore established in the book. So in the show's version, in my version, the show doesn't care, and they do have warships, or at least some. Anyway, so Jon makes it clear that he trusts her to keep up with her, to keep up her end of the bargain once Cersei's defeated, because Jon trusts her, and there's heavy romantic feelings implied in that statement, again building the romance between them. And then before he leaves to go to this mission up north, he leaves Davos behind as an emissary and spokesperson to Daenerys. So it's sort of he's leaving an emissary, so there's some still connection between their new alliance. So during one of Daenerys' meetings on what she has another big council meeting about what she should do next, and she talks about how she secured the Reach, by retaking Highgarden. She secured the Riverlands with Grey Worm and Jorah, and she has most of the Westerlands under siege as the Lannister forces are stretching themselves too thin because, as I said, it's already been established they lost more than half of their forces during the Loot Train battle, so those forces are very thin at this stage. A lot of those forces that she lost had joined Daenerys, so that just even strengthened Daenerys' forces even more. And she secured an alliance with the North and the Vale by making an alliance with Jon. So that just leaves Dorne and the Stormlands. So Varys suggests that she travel to Dorne to meet with Lord Ironwood, spelled with a Y, who has become the new Prince of Dorne after Ellaria Sand and the Sand Snakes had died, and he suggests that she meet with him to secure an alliance there. Again, we got no mention of what the hell happened to Dorne after the Sand Snakes died. I know that's because the writers, the showrunners, want to forget about Dorne because it was such a disaster in season 5. But I'm sorry, it still exists, and you still need to address it. And I think you kill off the Sand Snakes, so good. You got rid of the worst part of Dorne, and you can introduce another Dornish character that doesn't suck, like Oberyn in season 4, and have that to still be a factor that Daenerys wants to make sure she gets all the 7 kingdoms, because I thought that was the whole point. Anyway, so then Tyrion talks about how the Stormlands are divided after the power vacuum left behind from the Baratheons all dying off, and that the houses there feud amongst themselves, and there's no clear ruler. So Davos says that he knows someone who might help unite the Stormlands. If they give him a boat and a way to get to King's Landing, he can find someone who could help. So again, this is also the Stormlands, never mentioned in the show ever since Renly Stannis died. No mention of what the hell happened to the Stormlands. They're just kind of there. Again, I think in a situation like this, where she's trying to take over all of Westeros, you need to address what happened to each of these kingdoms. So they're also addressing what they're doing about the Stormlands. And also, I think, in my mind, it makes sense that the houses are divided because no clear ruler has been established there. So that's what they're going to try to do, establish a clear leader there. Sam. So we then see Sam and Gilly reading the Forbidden Books, and he discovers something important as he learns of the legend of the Horn of Winter, capable of bringing down the wall, and also reads that it's an item that the Night King would be searching for. Okay, alright, I gotta talk about this, because from all these videos, the entire thing that I'm rewriting season 7, this is the one thing I expect to get the most pushback for. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe it won't be, but I'm kind of expecting that would be the biggest thing I will get the most pushback for, is introducing the Horn of Winter. Because even I myself, before season 7 aired, I myself saying there's going to be no Horn of Winter, no horns of dragon, no horns whatsoever. It hasn't been established in the show. I was like very clear on this. I keep reiterating. Some people was like, oh, maybe that horn that Sam found in season 2 is actually the Horn of Winter. I'm like, no, no horns. It's not going to happen. And I was right. It didn't happen. But the more I think about it, the more I think they could have actually introduced the Horn in season 7. I mean, granted, I will grant it was not introduced in the show at all, but they can set up for it by having Sam read it in the Forbidden Books. Now, those who are familiar with my channel, how I felt about the ending of season 7, will know the main reason of why I'm introducing the Horn, because I want an alternative to the Dragon White bringing down the wall, which I was completely unhappy with. And I remember when I complained about that initially, I even got some comments of people saying, what, would you rather they do the Horn? That would be way worse. And to be honest, I kept trying to think of a third alternative, but again, I'm not a professional writer. I don't work for a TV show. I'm not a scriptwriter. I'm just some guy in his bedroom spouting out stuff. So I was hoping that the actual professional writers would be able to come up with a better alternative than a stupid fan service white dragon, but apparently not. So I had to fall back to the novels and go with the Horn. But here's the thing with the Horn. By introducing, and I realized this when I was reworking season 7, by introducing the Horn of Winter, It solves like a lot of problems. It just like has a domino effect that solved a lot of issues I had with season 7. So it actually works to a huge advantage. There's 5 major issues that it solves that I'll go through as I go through the show. So I'll mention the first one, since I touched on the first issue that it solves here, is that it gives Sam something important to find in the Forbidden books. Because in the show he's finding, oh, there's Dragonglass and Dragonstone. Yeah, no shit, Sam. Everybody knows that. Davos knows that. Davos should have just told John about it. It's ridiculous that the whole... granted, they could still use the Forbidden books in Season 8 and come up with something else, but they needed to be something in Season 7, and that Dragonglass BS is not good enough. You need something better for Sam to find that is important information, and finding out about the horn and the way to sort of pre-establish it and pre-establish the next goal. That is important information, so it makes the Forbidden books, the Forbidden Library, important for Season 7. Anyway, moving on. So, Sam writes John warning him about the horns. So, we then get a scene, the same scene that we got in the show of the Maesters getting a warning from Maester Wolkin up in Winterfell, telling them about Bran's visions, and they're all dicks about it, just like they were in the show, and Sam tries to speak up, and he's dismissed. So this scene's pretty much the same as it was in the show. So then we then get a scene of Sam getting fed up, partly fueled by what he learned about the Night King in the books, and the Maesters trying to, being dicks about the whole thing and trying to keep the books from him. So he's convinced the Maesters can't help. So he takes Gilly and leaves Old Town to go up north. Now, so this scene would be pretty much the same as it was in the show, but there's different connotations when you add in the thing of what he found out about the Night King. So there's more of an urgency and more of a reason for him to be pissed at the Maesters. Jon Snow. While waiting for Daenerys at Dragonstone, he receives a raven from Sam informing him about the Horn of Winter that would allow the Night King to bring down the wall. He then receives another letter from Bran informing him that he can see the Night King is getting closer to finding the Horn of Winter and that Jon needs to leave immediately to try to stop him. So, okay, I talked about how the Horn of Winter introducing it solves 5 major issues. I've mentioned the first one. Now let me get to the second major issues it solves. It gives Jon a good reason to go on a quest up north beyond the wall, because the reason they used in the show was beyond BS. I don't want to get too much into it. If you see my reviews, I talked about this at length, how going up to find a white in order to make a truce with Cersei was the stupidest reason. It was a dumb plan. They ended up just giving the Night King the means that he needed to take down the wall. And just to make a truce with Cersei, which she doesn't honor, which of course she wouldn't honor. They were stupid to think she would honor it anyway. The whole plan was stupid. So, by introducing the horn, you give Jon a good reason to go up north, not a flimsy reason. It's not, oh, I'm going to make a truce with Cersei. No, he needs to stop the Night King from bringing down the wall and invading Westeros, so it makes it a lot urgent and makes this mission important. And so, yeah, anyway. So, when Daenerys returns, he convinces her to let him go north to stop the Night King. So he travels to Winterfell to get help. So he goes to Winterfell on his way north, which of course he would. Why wouldn't he? Anyway, Arya, Sansa, and Bran. So Arya confronts Sansa about the letter in a scene that's similar to the one we got in the show, where Arya says some of the same things, like comparing Sansa at that age to Lyanna Mormont, saying how she would react if she was in that situation. But when she talks about seeing her on the stage with her father when her father was executed, she also brings up the fact that Littlefinger was there, and why is she trusting him now? Because he was there with Cersei, standing with her and Joffrey when they executed her father, which would be a good point, so why wouldn't she bring this up? So she makes it less about the letter and more about what Sansa is doing currently now and how she can tell she's conspiring against Jon. So this is very important because a lot of people didn't buy the scene. I kind of didn't buy the scene in the show because she was too focused too much on what Sansa did, which she's being a bit ridiculous. I mean, she did make some good points about Lyanna, but her case was pretty weak. So my version, she's not going to focus that much on that. She's just going to use that as a stepping stone to focus more on her conspiring with Littlefinger now, which is actually the bigger issue. And of course, the fact that Littlefinger was there also it ties into the letter, ties into what's happening currently. And in my version, Sansa is in fact conspiring with Littlefinger because she has this contingency plan and Arya can sense it, so it makes Arya more correct and not seeming batshit crazy like she did in the show. So she uses the letter as an example to show her disloyalty to House Stark, and she threatens to expose her to the Northern Lords by showing them the letter. So that's similar to the show where she said by showing the other lords the letter that would ruin her reputation, which is true. So she still has that threat. So we then get a really trippy scene of Bran reaching out with his ravens, kind of similar to what we did in the show. But instead of like just the Night King looking up and seeing the ravens and they fuck off, it's different than that. It's a trippy sequence with a lot of images flashing by very quickly that illustrates that the Night King is looking for the Horn of Winter. When Bran comes out of it, Sansa's standing over him, concerned, and he tells her that they need to send a raven to Jon. So as I mentioned before, I'm doing stuff a little out of order because I'm going by character. So this is obviously before the scene where Jon receives the raven, but we get build up to that with Bran having his vision, which again, this makes Bran more useful because he was kind of useless, honestly. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention this, and I want to make this clear because I should make this clear about Bran. Probably should have mentioned this earlier, but he never says that he can see everything, that he knows everything, because he said that in the show, and he was very ineffectual, and it makes him seem like he's an idiot or a moron, and so he never says anything like that in my version, so he doesn't come off as a moron. He just comes off as someone who has visions of certain places and looks. He never says that he can see and know everything, because that's BS. Anyway, we get more character scenes between Arya and the Hound, as he can tell that Arya is pissed off. She doesn't say what she's pissed off about specifically, but he offers her some vague advice. Daenerys. So they give Davos his boat and he goes to King's Landing in secret and finds Gendry. But unlike in the show, Gendry isn't so willing to just give up everything and go on an adventure for seemingly no good reason, just because he feels like it. In fact, he says that he's sick of running and he's made a life for himself, which would, I know is kind of the reluctant hero cliche, and the show kind of was subverting that, but it actually works in this case, and it makes sense for Gendry's character, even though it's a cliche. It's a cliche for a reason, because it really works, and here it fits. But anyway, Davos tells him that he was always meant for something more, and this is his chance. So Davos has to convince him to go with him, and so Gendry agrees to go back with him to Dragonstone, where they have plans to make him Lord of the Stormlands as the only Baratheon heir, as Daenerys will legitimize him as Gendry Baratheon. So I know something may think this is crazy, a little over the top, but it gives a good reason for Gendry coming back in the show rather than fan service. Rather than, oh, people like Gendry, so let's just have Davos stop by and, hey, Gendry, come on an adventure. He's like, sure, I'm going on an adventure, blah, 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 blah. No, you have a good reason for why Davos seeks out Gendry, and he's something that he's useful for, and actually brings up his heritage to Baratheon, which they kind of been teasing forever, and makes good use out of it. So meanwhile, Daenerys travels to Dorne to meet with Prince Ironwood, spelled with the Y, who is very dubious at first, as he didn't support Alaria, and he says that he's glad that those kinslayers are dead, which is something that needs to be said in the show because it made no sense that they were able to take Dorne like that. Now, Ironwood in the novels, this house was kind of seen as the sort of rival to the Martells, which is kind of why I chose them, because it seems like it would make the most sense that they would fill the power vacuum if all the Martells were wiped out. And it seems like he would not be okay with Alaria Sand at all, and so he'd be happy that they're dead. And so he also says that he's not afraid of Daenerys or her dragons, because Dorne has fought off our Targaryen dragons before, again referencing history. So Daenerys takes a more diplomatic approach, showing that she's capable. See, this is something the show doesn't do enough, in my opinion, because I think it needs to. I know Daenerys has that fiery approach, but she had all these sage advice from like Tyrion, Jorah, and I think she should have a diplomatic side as well. So we see that more, instead of like saying, "I'm going to burn you alive." She realizes, she learns from her mistakes that she needs to take a more diplomatic approach in this matter. So she talks about how the more recent history of Dorne, Dorne has been the Targaryens' closest allies. So she offers Dorne a lot of high positions in her new role, so a lot of perks, and offers to settle any disputes that they have with the Reach in their favor. So, because the Dorne and the Reach have historically always feuded over, resources or land, so she says, "I'm going to side with you in any outstanding disputes." So, Ironwood ultimately agrees to this deal. So, he basically bends the knee to her. Or not really, but have that same thing where they're princes, so they're not one of the kingdoms. The same arrangement they had before. Anyway, meanwhile, in the Riverlands, we see the Unsullied fighting off Lannister soldiers who were terrorizing the Riverlands and setting farms on fire, thus, and so the Unsullied are stopping the Lannisters from doing this, thus protecting the people, because this is something we've seen the Lannisters doing since Season 2, and there's no reason to think that they would just stop by and have a pop star sing and stop doing it. They would still be doing this. And so we have the Unsullied come in and stop them from doing this, which of course would make them look like heroes in the eyes of the people who live in the Riverlands. So Jorah then meets with Edmure and informs him of the alliance that Daenerys has already made with the North and the Vale, and offers to make him Lord Paramount of the Riverlands, and promises to provide them with food and protection, which they demonstrate they will already be bringing food, because they will already be bringing some food with them, and of course providing them protection. So, mentioning the North and the Vale, of course, is really enticing the deal, because the Riverlands have close ties to the North, particularly in the most recent battle. So they say, "We're already friends with your friends, so why don't you be friends with us?" So Edmure references his ancestor, who also was made Lord of the Riverlands by Aegon Targaryen, because that's how the Tullys became Lords of the Riverlands in the first place. And so he says, like him, he's willing to bend the knee to Daenerys in exchange for getting rid of the Lannisters from the Riverlands for good and helping them feed the people. Because it's the same with Aegon. The Riverlands were being terrorized, ruled by Harren the Black, who was from the Iron Islands, and Aegon got rid of him, so the Riverlands joined the Targaryens. So the same thing basically happened here. They get rid of the Lannisters, so they'll, bend the knee or whatever, join Daenerys. So together, Jorah and Edmure lead the forces in a retake Riverrun, which he is once again makes the capital of the Riverlands. So meanwhile, in Dragonstone, we get a few more scenes of Tyrion with Jaime as he tries to convince him to help them reason with Cersei, as he tells Jaime the progress Daenerys has been making in securing every one of the 7 kingdoms. And Jaime slowly starts to break and realizes that it's best for him to surrender. So, when Daenerys returns with Jorah and Grey Worm, now back at Dragonstone as well, and Gendry now officially the Lord of the Stormlands, she holds a meeting with her council of Tyrion, Jorah, Varys, Gendry, Davos, Theon, Grey Worm, and Missandei. There, Tyrion tries to convince her to let Jaime go, and return to Cersei, where he agrees to try to talk her into surrendering, as he's sure that he's the only one who can do it. Daenerys is against this at first, but both Tyrion and Varys make convincing arguments, so she eventually acquiesces. They talk about how they won over the continent, but King's Landing still refuses to give in to the siege. The Lannisters have consolidated their forces at King's Landing, and even with the massive amount of forces Daenerys has gathered, she still will not be able to take King's Landing without killing the majority of the civilian population there, and that is still unacceptable to her. So this is something I think needed to be in the show, because I thought the actual season 7 was very, very vague about how much power Daenerys had and how much power Cersei had. They seemed to imply that Daenerys had all the power and that Cersei was fucked. But Cersei was still acting like she wasn't fucked, so that didn't make any sense to me. Here, we're going to clarify this. She has all 7 kingdoms, and Cersei just has a small piece of land in King's Landing she's still refusing to give up. So, Daenerys' naval forces from Theon's Ironborn, the Reach ships, because the Reach has ships too, and the Manderleys has secured the sea around King's Landing, but Euron's fleet is still out there somewhere, and he still holds the Iron Islands. And he still has Yara captive. Theon keeps asking that he be allowed to rescue Yara, but Daenerys keeps refusing, saying that they just fall into Euron's trap, which he's actually correct, and that Euron wants him to go after him, and that's the whole point. So, Tyrion then suggests the way to resolve the standstill in King's Landing is with spies. They'll sneak people into the city to spread the word that Daenerys is feeding the people of Westeros, and if they open the gates to her, she'll feed them too and take care of them. So Gendry says that he'll take charge of that because he's familiar with the city and the common folk. So this is actually because Tyrion, this is something I said in the actual season 7, pretty much all advice Tyrion gave to Daenerys sucked. He was an idiot, and that is a very misuse of Tyrion, because Tyrion is supposed to be a genius, he's supposed to be witty, he's supposed to be smart, so we actually see him suggesting something that is smart, that is witty. It's similar to what he did in Meereen, where he was able to win over the city by spreading the word that Daenerys is great, and actually showcasing that by helping people out, feeding them, whatever. So he's doing the same thing. Also, it has kind of a similar tinge of like Grey Worm sneaking into Meereen in season 4 and sort of spreading the word and opening the gates from within rather than external siege. And also it's good use of Gendry, because Gendry's familiar with King's Landing, other than going up to the wall where he should have been no good. He's not used to cold weather, and he can't run that fucking far that fucking fast. But I'll get to that later. Anyway, so it makes good use of him, where he is familiar with the city King's Landing, having been living there the whole time. He's familiar with the common folk, so he knows exactly what to do. So, Jorah also brings up the fact that there are still a few houses left in the Reach, the Riverlands, and the Stormlands that refuse to bend the knee to her. So Daenerys smiles and says, "Leave that to me." So we then get a montage of Daenerys going to the various houses with their dragons. Some of them surrender immediately. Others she has to burn first before they surrender, but they all eventually bend the knee to her. So this, I think, is, again, very important. Establishes exactly that Daenerys is winning over Westeros and how she's doing it. And this montage doesn't have to be too long. It could just be like a minute or two, just very quickly. That's all you need, showing her taking over these houses. So, next we get a montage of the common folk sneaking the Unsullied into the city, like sneaking into King's Landing, securing the gate, and opening up to the Unsullied, and sneaking them into the city. And eventually the Lannister forces have to fall back to the Red Keep because the Unsullied has just flooded King's Landing. So again, it shows the dynamic, it shows smart tactics, whatever. It shows her trying to take over King's Landing. Jon Snow. So Jon Snow arrives at Winterfell, and then he sends for Dolorous Edd to meet him at Eastwatch, where they intend to go beyond the wall. So, yes, I'm saying that Dolorous Edd is going to be involved in this adventure. I think he should have been. The Night's Watch still have a presence at the wall, as they should. And Jon Snow stops by Winterfell because he's going that way anyway. I mean, some people argue, well, it's more inland. If you go by boat, you can go directly Eastwatch. It takes longer to go inland all the way to Winterfell. I think he does that. He needs to take the time to do that because he needs to settle things first and gather forces before heading up north. So he has a touching reunion with Arya and convinces her to work with Sansa. So I think the show is pushing back the Jon and Arya reunion to season 8, and I might be pushing things having it a bit early, but I think it's important for the storyline for them to meet this season. And it's a bit ridiculous that they pushed it off too far. Anyway, he meets with the Northern Lords and tells them that they need to start fortifying the northern castles in case the White Walkers do break through the wall. So he's kind of falling back from the castles on the wall and saying, actually, let's bring a bulk of those forces back and fortify these northern castles, because now it looks like there's a possibility the White Walkers could just break through the wall, so we need to prepare for that eventuality. He also informs the Lords that his new alliance with Daenerys, which they are less thrilled about, but Wyman Manderly agrees to send ships and support. So he meets with Bran, who warns him firsthand of the Night King and the White Walkers and says that he needs to stop them. He gives a very cryptic phrase that will help him later on, so Bran being useful again, and it appears he has something else to tell Jon, but he doesn't, saying that he doesn't want him distracted and just wishes him luck on his journey. So I'm also pushing back the Bran telling Jon about his heritage until season 8, because the show did this. I had to use, because they meet, they have to use a kind of TV cliche where it's just oh, I'll tell you later. But I think it fits here. He doesn't want him distracted. Anyway, so Jon also meets with the Hound and the Brotherhood Without Banners that know about his quest and somehow were already aware of the need to stop the Night King from getting the horn, so they convince him to take him with them, rather than getting this stupid scene at the Eastwatch where they're all in prison, they're all bickering at each other, come with me. This makes more sense. The Hound and Brotherhood approach Jon and say, let us go with you. So Sansa also orders Brienne to go with Jon so that she can report to her firsthand of the White Walker threat. But it's suspected that she sent Brienne away because Littlefinger was worried that she might side with Arya against her. Which is similar in the show, but in the show she sends Brienne to King's Landing. I'm adding Brienne and Podrick to the mission up north. I just think that makes more sense. Anyway, so Jon travels to Eastwatch with the Hound, Thoros, Beric, Brienne, and Podrick, and we get some good character interactions between them on the way, and Jon and the Hound settle their differences. The Hound and Brienne touch base, and they have no hard feelings. Arya, Sansa, and Bran. So Jon Snow returns to Winterfell on his way to the Wall, where he has a touching reunion with Arya and Bran. Arya tells Jon about the letter she found and that Sansa and Littlefinger are plotting against him. So Jon defends Sansa, saying that the letter doesn't prove anything, which of course he would, and he gives Arya a speech about how the Starks need to stick together, and he explains to Arya what Sansa went through in King's Landing and what she went through being married to Ramsay. So this is something Sansa couldn't really explain to Arya herself, because she knew that Arya wouldn't really take it seriously and would see it more as a defensive posture. But having Jon explain it to her does make Arya rethink things, and she starts to reconsider her feelings towards Sansa. And so after Jon leaves again, we get a scene where a serving girl enters Littlefinger's room asking to serve him, and Littlefinger simply reacts by saying, "Hello, Arya." Littlefinger then says that he knows that she's there to kill him, but if she does, he's made arrangements that Jon won't make it back alive from his northern adventure and that he'll meet with an unfortunate accident. Also, he's paid off lords that will ensure that Sansa will know that she killed him no matter how hard she tries to cover her tracks, and Sansa will execute her for murder and then will be Queen of the North. So the serving girl says that she doesn't know what he's talking about, that she's just a serving girl, and leaves. But once she's in the hallway, we see her put away the dagger that she was concealing and then take off her face to reveal it was in fact Arya. Now this, I think, is very important. Again, it shows Littlefinger's not a putz. He's a mastermind. He's a badass. He knows about Arya, and he was prepared. He had contingency plans. He had ways to deal with her, and she thought she would just sneak in and kill him, but he overshows it. I think this is exactly the kind of scene the show needed. Also, it shows that Arya is sort of putting the blame, because of her talk with Jon, she's putting the blame less on Sansa and more on Littlefinger. The Hound and the Brotherhood without banners. So after several days, the Hound asks Beric why they're still there in Winterfell. Why are they just waiting around? They should have moved on after a couple days. But Beric says that they're waiting, and when the Hound asks what for, he says, "You'll see." And then, when Jon Snow arrives, Beric goes to him and asks to go north, so that's what he was waiting for. He knew that Jon would arrive because he got the vision of the flame or whatever, and so they were waiting for Jon to show up so they could go with him. Cersei. So we get a scene of Qyburn reporting to Cersei that their forces in the Riverlands and the Westerlands are losing badly as Daenerys gains more allies, and he informs her that she is now allied with every major kingdom except for the Iron Islands. So Cersei finally orders the bulk of their forces to retreat to King's Landing to make a final stand. Qyburn and Cersei look over the walls of the Red Keep as Daenerys' massive forces surround King's Landing and begin a siege. Qyburn explains that their forces are strong enough to prevent them from storming the keep, but not strong enough to break the siege. She then asks about Euron, and Qyburn says that there's been no word on his whereabouts. She then asks what happens if Daenerys decides to storm the Red Keep with her dragons and simply light them all on fire. Qyburn responds by saying there's something he wants to show her. So we then see them go underground, where Qyburn shows off his scorpion ballistas. And he mentions that dragons have been killed before. Most notably, the Dornish managed to kill Visenya's dragon using a weapon similar to this. And Qyburn has studied the method on how this was done, and Cersei looks pleased. So this is similar to what we get in the show, but it had much later in the season. But Qyburn brings up history, which I think is important to do. And it's not just that he has these scorpion weapons, it's that he knows how to use them as well, because he studied history. He studied exactly every time a dragon was killed, including in the Dance of Dragons war as well, and studied the best way to kill a dragon, and makes that clear to Cersei. So we then see Jaime return to the Red Keep after Daenerys has let him go, and he pleads her terms of surrender, which Jaime highly recommends, but Cersei refuses. When Jaime insists that she should accept these terms, she says that he shouldn't have bothered coming back if he was just going to be whiny. So we get a similar dialogue as we did in the show, where Jaime reveals that Olenna killed Joffrey and not Tyrion, and Cersei reveals that she's pregnant, and so she says that she's never gonna surrender. So that is it for part 2 of how I would write Game of Thrones Season 7. Just a couple of days, I will release part 3, the final part, which will cover episodes 8 through 10, straight to the finale. And yes, 10 episode season, most Definitely. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Keep an eye out for part 3. I'll have that up in a couple of days. Also check out my channel as I do many other Game of Thrones videos, as well as other videos and other shows like Star Trek, The Expanse, Lost, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.